I'm Chris Collins, and I'm a professor here at Boston University School of Law. And I'm happy to introduce the Historical Perspectives panel. Hannah Rosen's End of Men and the Rise of Women captures a current phenomenon, which she claims, and I quote, and Hannah, I'm sure you've had your work quoted back to you a lot today, quote, of 200,000 years of human history and the beginning of time, that her End of Men phenomenon is a culmination of 200,000 years of human history and the beginning of a new era. Now, there will be considerable debate over how accurately she has captured this phenomenon, women's rise and men's decline, and whether her assertions hold true today across different sectors. But before we get into, or when we get into, again, the empirical challenges that Rosen's thesis undoubtedly invite, the speakers on this panel will help put End of Men claims in historical perspective to give us a longer view. I don't think any of us are going to comment on the last 2,000 years, but there have been several moments when anxiety about men's end and women's ascendancy have had significant purchase, and we'll hear about some of those moments in U.S. history from the panelists. And the panelists are: Lynda Dodd is the Joseph H. Flom Professor of Legal Studies and Political Science at the City College of New York. She earned her PhD in political science at Princeton and holds a JD from Yale. She has written extensively about the women's suffrage movement, women's citizenship, and constitutional change, and her paper today builds on that work. Serena Mayeri is a professor of law and history at the University of Pennsylvania. She earned a PhD and a JD from Yale University, and her book, Reasoning from Race, Feminism, Law, and the Civil Rights Revolution, received the Darlene Clark Hine Award from the Organization of American Historians. Martin Summers is Associate Professor in the Department of History and African Diaspora Studies at Boston College. He earned his PhD at Rutgers and is the author of Manliness and Its Discontent, The Black Middle Class and the Transformation of Masculinity, 1900 to 1930, which was awarded the American Historical Association Pacific Coast Branch Book Award. Finally, Stephanie Coontz teaches history and family studies at the Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington. She is the author of too many books to list, but her most recent volumes include A Strange Stirring, The Feminine Mystique in American Women at the Dawn of the 1960s, and Marriage, A History, How Love Conquered Marriage. For those of you who are based in Boston, you should also know that this coming Monday, Stephanie Coontz will give a talk at BU's Hillel House, which is just up the street on Bay State Road, called For Better and Worse, The Historical Transformation of Marriage. With that, I turn the podium over to Professor Lynda Dodd. Each panelist will speak for about 10 minutes, followed by a brief commentary by me, and then we will open up the floor to you for discussion.
So I do have some photos, and hopefully we can get these loaded in a second. About 100 years ago, the term feminism came into wider use in journals, magazines, and in the popular press generally. Nancy Cott's wonderful book, The Grounding of Modern Feminism, discusses these changes and the reactions to the ideas that were flowing at this time. One of the things that I found interesting in my work on the campaign for the 19th Amendment for women's suffrage is that although all feminists were suffragists, not all suffragists were feminists, and so it was considered to be a slightly narrower group and perhaps a scarier group to the people who opposed women's suffrage. For this paper, I wanted to look at the claims of anti-suffragists to see what kind of reaction they offered to both the claim that women should vote and also these arguments about feminism, especially women's right to work independently for a period of time and even the possibility of dual career marriages. And I focused on Massachusetts because what I learned from reading some of the work about anti-suffrage associations throughout the United States is that they were really centered in the Northeast, especially New York and Boston. And it was upper-class women who organized these groups. Their families funded the campaign against the 19th Amendment. In Boston, they were really old Boston Brahmin families that organized to protest suffrage both at the state level in Massachusetts, and they had the resources to assist in campaigns across the country. So why would that be? I think that there were some political motivations for anti-suffragists. It wasn't just a reaction to the claims of feminists, although they do bring those up. So I wanted to just talk briefly about some of their arguments. To really get a full sense of what they were concerned about, I looked at their journal. It's called the Remonstrance. That's a kind of petition that they would offer to the state legislature in Massachusetts almost each year when these suffrage proposals were introduced. They called themselves Remonstrants, and their journal is called the Remonstrance. I looked at 30 years of the journal. The journal is basically a collection of excerpts from other magazines. They didn't often write their own editorial commentary, but I did find a number of examples where they would directly respond to some of the claims of suffragists and feminists. So over the course of 30 years, I saw a lot of patterns to the arguments that they were making. First, they were concerned about their political position. So it wasn't really a claim about traditional womanhood and the threat that suffrage posed to the family. They were concerned about political power. So these women who were from upper-class families felt that they had more political power serving as leaders of charitable groups and on different kinds of political commissions. They were worried about the threat that would happen if suffrage was extended to women from all ranks of society. Their voice would be diluted after that, and they believed that they would be charged with undue partisanship when they spoke in the future about social reform. So there was a real claim that women were better off without the ballot, that they could speak on behalf of women and do so with more power if they didn't have the vote. And actually, for the Massachusetts Association opposed to the extension of suffrage, it's a mouthful of a name, that group really did focus on those arguments. So only really around 1910 did they begin to quote from journal articles talking about feminism and raise concerns about the rise of the new woman and the threat that the new woman would pose to the traditional family. And in the final decade of the suffrage campaign, they did write some articles that offered strong challenges to this. But the women in the Massachusetts organization weren't the ones writing the most strident rhetoric. And I have some examples of anti-suffrage literature that I hope to show you that were produced in other parts of the country, usually by organizations and general newspapers that were run by men. So the men's rhetoric was more dismissive about the new woman and feminism and how this would upset the traditional gender division of labor in the family. The groups that were organizing upper-class women to oppose suffrage, I think, used language that was much more moderate. They tried to appeal to male voters who were making all the decisions about who was going to get the vote, to not be overly chivalrous and assume women wanted to vote. So they kept making claims, we are the silent majority. Please don't assume because you see women in the streets marching that all women want the vote. Recognize that there are many of us, the true majority, that do not want the right to vote. And so it was only rarely that they invoked the specter of feminism and the changes in the family. But when they did, I think their claims were pretty powerful. They talked not only about the natural roles of men and women and religious edicts that support the traditional gender division of labor, they also made a lot of consequentialist arguments. They followed closely what happened in the Western states that did extend the vote to women early. And I tried to show that there was actually no support for the claim of municipal housekeeping or civic housekeeping that a lot of suffragists were making at the time. That claim suggested that if women were given the right to vote, they would do things to reduce infant mortality or to make the cities cleaner. And when they examined some of these Western states, especially Colorado, which did have an urban center, they found that really the more progressive policies could be found in New York and Boston and other strongholds of anti-suffrage sentiment. So these consequentialist arguments, I think, were a big focus for them. But then they did talk about things like divorce rates and the possibility that there would be increased rancor in the household if men and women had differences about political issues. And they even pointed to rising divorce rates in the West. And they gave many examples of, in newspaper articles, of couples registering their dissent publicly and how unseeming this was. And then the final thing that I think is really significant about the arguments that the anti-suffragists made is that eventually, I think, they wanted men to realize that, and the male voters who were making these final decisions, that there would be consequences for them if the claims that feminists were making were accepted. And so I found some flyers that anti-suffrage groups would send to states that were holding referenda about women's suffrage, and they were direct appeals to working class men. Feminism means women will work. They will take your jobs, and is this what you want when you give women the right to vote? Suffrage will lead to feminism, and feminism will lead to you losing your jobs. So it's not clear from what I read how successful those claims were, but they were claims that eventually were made during this campaign. Even though women in most of the states that were deciding suffrage issues weren't in a position to vote, the anti-suffragists still appealed to women. They wanted to convince women that feminism would not lead to happiness for them. And so there is a lot of literature that was sent trying to show women who pursued feminist claims were pursuing a false path. And the path would lead, there's a great illustration in one of the newspapers that showed, the pursuit of professional fame will lead to anxiety, stress, and then the last step is loneliness. So they were trying to make arguments to women that this was also a dangerous pursuit for them. One of the things that I think is really interesting about the final stage of the campaign is that there was so much emphasis on women organizing, and men weren't organizing to the extent that women did to oppose the vote. And in the final few years, there was a man's suffrage association, but it was funded by the Massachusetts organization, the New York organization. The men weren't leading the anti-suffrage wing. And I'm not sure exactly why that is, but the women were doing most of the work and producing most of the journals and literature about anti-suffrage. There are a few things that I just wanted to mention about maybe the lessons of this campaign for contemporary discussion. I think the only political scientist participating in the conference, one of the things I noted reading through Hannah Rosen's series of portraits is that there's very little in her book about contemporary disparities in representation in political office. And there is a lot of political science literature on this, and traditional gendered-based assumptions about appropriate women's behavior, I think, figure into it. So there's some surveys that have been done by Jennifer Lawless and Richard Fox, two political scientists, about why women choose to run for office, and a lot of assumptions about the ugliness of campaigns and the demands of running regularly for re-election figure into it. So women don't feel like they can combine a political career with a family. They find it an unattractive prospect, and they are difficult to recruit. And then the other literature that is coming out this year in a book by Debbie Brooks called He Runs, She Runs, looks at the recent phenomena that we've all experienced with Hillary Clinton's campaign of differential treatment of male and female candidates who run for national office or other high-ranking elected positions. And the women do experience, I think, different treatment at the hands of the press. And that probably has also affected younger women's sense that maybe elective office isn't an attractive prospect. So I did want to mention that some of this literature that I was reading from the anti-suffragists about the importance of maintaining a gender division of labor and the importance of acknowledging the differences between men and women. Some of these traditional assumptions about gender still play a role today and affect women's equality in the political sphere. And you see these assumptions play out throughout Hannah Rosen's book. So I think they're still powerful today, and I hope we'll have a lot of time for discussion about them.
Morning, everyone. The title of my talk is Manhood Rights in the Age of Jim Crow, Evaluating End-of-Men Claims in the Context of African American History. And I'm just going to go right into it since we don't have much time. Now, American history has seen its share of episodic crises of American masculinity. Or to be more precise, American history has seen its share of periods during which American men experienced a heightened collective anxiety that they were in danger of losing not only their privileged status in society, but the very foundational ideas by which manhood was defined. There have been numerous historical moments when larger political and economic transformations have precipitated a societal redefinition of manhood, such as the emergence of liberalism and the market revolution in the first half of the 19th century, which has been discussed by people like Professor Kimmel, as well as E. Anthony Rotundo. My paper will examine another important period during which anxieties about the decline of American men were pervasive, the late 19th century. It was during this period that white American men particularly felt their manhood being undermined by the corporatization of the economy and the decline of proprietary capitalism, the closing of the frontier, and the incursion of women into the political realm through reform and suffrage movements. They responded in a variety of ways, from becoming more involved in the education of boys and defining manhood in terms of physicality to reasserting their role in church leadership and advocating for a more aggressive foreign policy, or actually American imperialism. Claims about the end of men then informed everything from US foreign policy and ideas about education to changing leisure practices and conceptions of sexuality. The late 19th century is also an interesting period to examine because it was during this time that the South witnessed the emergence of legal and customary forms of discrimination that eroded the citizenship rights of the overwhelming majority of African American men and women. In the wake of the redemption of democratic state governments in the 1880s and the 1890s, all of the states of the former Confederacy began to implement statutory and constitutional laws that enforced the separation of races in educational institutions, sites of commerce and public space, established practically insurmountable barriers to voting, and made it possible for the landed elite to reassert its economic dominance and control over a formerly enslaved labor force. Moreover, this matrix of discriminatory laws was reinforced by the ever-present threat of extralegal violence in the form of lynching, rape, and race riots. While both black men and women were victims of this racial backlash, my paper will explore how the struggle over fundamental issues of equality was framed in the gendered language of manhood rights, illustrating how African American men understood segregation and disfranchisement to pose an existential threat to their status as citizens as much as their identity as men. In a political environment in which women did not have suffrage, citizenship and manhood were inextricably linked. Middle-class African-American men, whom this paper focuses on, responded to these assaults on their citizenship status, in part by attempting to establish their dominance within their own communities. although they did not reduce their male identity to their political relationship to the dominant culture or to the state. Middle-class African-American men did seek to shore up their masculinity by reasserting their control vis-a-vis black women, black youth, and working-class black men in the areas of church and missionary work and the guidance of black youth, or the socialization of black youth. But these attempts did not go unchallenged, especially in the case of black women. While there was a great deal of collaboration between African-American women and men in building up their communities and defending them against white racism, women certainly did not cede leadership of the race to men. As historian Martha Jones argues about black public culture in the 19th century, rather than being, quote, patriarchal or male-dominated, it was an openly and often heatedly contested space in which activists self-consciously wrestled with the meanings of manhood and womanhood and the implications of those ideas for the structures and practices of institutions. So what I'm going to do with the rest of this talk is really briefly talk about three important areas. One is the redefinition of manhood in the late 19th century in response to these large economic and political transformations that were going on in the United States. Then I'll move on to a discussion of the assault on black citizenship and kind of the gender dimensions of that. And then lastly, I'll wrap up with how African-American men, middle-class African-American men, responded to that in the 1890s and the first decade or so of the 20th century. Now, one of the most important economic transformations that occurred in the late 19th century that had a profound impact on the gender identity of middle-class and elite white American men was the transformation of the economy. That is the emergence of corporate capitalism and the bureaucratization of the workforce. With these, you have a corresponding loss of economic independence for the majority of middle-class white American men, ownership of property and self-employment, which had been a hallmark of bourgeois manliness in the antebellum period, really becomes less attainable for increasing numbers of white men. So that's one important transformation that's going on. The other is the political challenges to white male authority by women, by immigrant men, and as well as working class white men, native-born white men, primarily through the labor movement and urban machine politics, and in the case of women, through the reform efforts in the areas of temperance and child labor, their suffrage activism, and their advocacy for a more peace-oriented foreign policy in the 1890s. White middle-class men and the elite white middle-class and elite men responded in part by redefining what constituted manhood and male authority, in addition to kind of just the brute deployment of political power. One of the ways in which they reconstituted manhood was through an elevation of the body and physicality over earlier constitutive elements of manhood, and particularly character. Consumption and leisure, or the goods that one owned, the leisure practices one engaged in, began to supplant earlier commitments to an earlier commitment to producer values as the marker of manliness, and this really dovetails nicely with the growing importance of consumption to the economy. It was also reflected in the very shift in the very ways that middle class defined or talked about manhood, and specifically the terms that they used. So the shift that Gail Biederman, the historian Gail Biederman, nicely illustrates from manliness, which had been a class and race-bound concept, to masculinity by the late 19th, early 20th century, which referred to the core essential qualities that all male bodies possess. White middle-class men and elite men also reinforced their own masculinity by positioning it against a feminized manhood of, an imagined feminized manhood of Native Americans, Asians, and African Americans. I'll talk about specifically about how this plays out in the case of African Americans in the South. The primary way that it played out is through white Southern men deploying a discourse that framed African Americans as incapable of exercising patriarchal authority over their homes. And you see this, for instance, in the vagrancy laws that were aimed at coercing labor out of this newly freed population in laws that required individuals to demonstrate that they had some form of employment, and how that really undermined African Americans' attempts to withdraw women from the labor force, even if they could, even if landowning black men, for instance, if they didn't need their wives to work in the wage labor force, it was still somewhat difficult for them to achieve that because of vagrancy laws were often not only used against black men, but also black women. Another important way in which white men undermined patriarchal authority of black men was through the use of vigilante violence, particularly by the Ku Klux Klan. And historian Hannah Rosen, not this Hannah Rosen, has really brilliantly discussed the uses of the nighttime raids by the Ku Klux Klan and how they were aimed at proving or reminding African American men that they did not actually have control over their own homes, right? So they did not have any kind of patriarchal authority. So how do black men actually respond to this? They respond by attempting to reassert their own authority along the lines of gender and class in their own homes, as well as in religious and civic institutions in the black community. And I'm running out of time, so I'll just briefly mention one, and that is the black church, which had been a relatively egalitarian space in terms of social rank and gender after the Civil War, and it increasingly becomes an institution in which women and the black working class or the black folk are marginalized. Black men actually reject, for instance, the prospects of women's ordination in the church, and they challenge black women's right to have any meaningful role in church governance. They also suppressed aspects of worship that they associated with working class blacks, such as the call and response and ecstatic worship. And maybe I can go over some of the other ways in which middle-class African-American men are attempting to reassert their authority within the community in the wake of disfranchisement during the Q&A. So I'll just wrap up by saying that in the late 19th century, there was a concern that a quote, economic and cultural power shift from men to women, from Hannah Rosen's Atlantic Quarterly article, was underway. But it was a concern that was perhaps more pervasive than that which is evidenced in the wake of the Great Recession of the 21st century. While this concern had significant transformative long-term cultural impacts, from the relationship between manhood and the body, to the changing valuation of leisure and consumption and constructions of masculinity, to the very redefinition of normative manhood itself. In many ways, claims about the end of men were cynical rhetorical ploys aimed at reasserting white male hegemony. Far more disconcerting for African American men in the late 19th century was the fact that they were systematically being stripped of their citizenship, still a foundational signifier of manhood at the turn of the 20th century. While they did not reduce the totality of their masculinity to their political relationship to the nation state, it was impossible for middle-class African-American men not to interpret their disfranchisement through the lens of their gender identity. As such, they moved to shore up their masculinity by reinforcing their difference from working-class black men and by marginalizing black women in the realm of reform activism and civic institution building. Unfortunately, this was a poor substitute for substantive citizenship rights. However, African American women and men would continue to collaborate in their efforts to achieve full citizenship, even as they struggled with each other over questions of gender, authority, and leadership within black communities. Thank you. Oh, I didn't open one.
Hi. So today I'd also like to talk about an earlier claim about the end of men that many of you may be familiar with, and how the reaction to it somewhat paradoxically helped to foster a feminist resurgence. In 1965, a Labor Department official named Daniel Patrick Moynihan wrote a report entitled The Negro Family, The Case for National Action. Intended to motivate the President Johnson and his deputies to launch massive federal employment and anti-poverty initiatives, Moynihan's report somewhat inadvertently sparked a debate that reverberated through the next half-century of social policy. Called everything from a subtle racist to a prescient prophet, Moynihan, in his assessment of urban black family life, have been endlessly analyzed, vilified, and rehabilitated by commentators in the years since his report identified a so-called tangle of pathology in poor African American communities. At the center of the pathology Moynihan lamented was a matriarchal family structure characterized by illegitimate births, welfare dependency, and juvenile delinquency. These are his terms. Until Black men reclaimed their proper place as breadwinning heads of household, the Moynihan Report suggested, poverty, violence, and dysfunction would persist. The Moynihan Report essentially forecast the end of men in inner-city Black America. Many liberal commentators and civil rights leaders excoriated the Moynihan Report for its unflattering picture of Black family life, and they interpreted Moynihan, and this part was arguably somewhat unfair, as rejecting structural, institutional, and economic explanations for poverty and racial inequality. But Moynihan's concerns about the growing number of female-headed households and the so-called emasculation of African American men did reflect a consensus within the liberal and civil rights establishments that a male breadwinner, female homemaker model was integral to racial progress. For these commentators, the rise of women within Black families, women's allegedly superior educational attainments and job prospects, necessarily entail the end of men. Moynihan and his liberal critics also agreed on the appropriate remedy, that government focus on improving the employment prospects of Black men with an eye toward reinstating them as primary breadwinners in marital households. Implicitly and sometimes explicitly, this vision entailed African American women marrying, withdrawing from the labor market, and staying home to care for children without, and this is key, without relying on public assistance. Now, despite the torrent of criticism that Moynihan's report faced, few people initially questioned his underlying premise, that the end of men and the rise of women went hand in hand, and that both of these developments were really deeply problematic. There was an exception to this consensus, though, and that was in the resurgent women's movement, and in particular African American feminists and their allies. These advocates for women vigorously disputed the assertions of Moynihan and others that Black women were flourishing in comparison to their male counterparts. Armed with labor market and other statistics, feminists pointed out that Black women's wages still lagged far behind all other demographic groups, including Black men. Black women, they pointed out, suffered from multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination in education, employment, and political life, in addition to shouldering the lion's share of responsibility for their family support and care. While Black men needed and deserved attention and government resources, initiatives designed to bolster the prospects of Black women were at least as necessary to ameliorating poverty and inequality, they argued. So it's popular today, even in liberal circles, to hear that Moynihan was right. Many of the trends he identified, high rates of non-marital childbearing, the concentration of crime and violence in impoverished urban neighborhoods, the dismal employment prospects of poor Black men, have only intensified, and some have spread throughout American society. For example of this claim, a recent book by historian James Patterson laments that the visceral negative reactions many liberals and civil rights leaders had to the Moynihan Report in the 1960s rendered serious discussion of the problems he identified verboten within social science and policy circles for years to come. But I'd like to suggest that the work of historians of race and gender suggests another side to the Moynihan Report and the negative reactions it provoked, a more productive and generative side. So far from choking off debate among advocates for women, the report helped to provide a focal point for feminist advocacy, not only on behalf of a genuine rise of women, but against the notion that the rise of women necessarily meant the end of men. Feminists saw ghosts of the Moynihan Report everywhere in the decades following its publication. From job training programs that favored men over women, to affirmative action programs designed to move men of color into traditionally male occupations, to the EEOC's failure to enforce Title VII against sex discrimination in employment, to complaints about rising rates of illegitimacy and welfare dependency, to educational enrichment programs that excluded girls of color, feminists of various stripes identified Moynihan thinking as the culprit. And feminists responded affirmatively as well as defensively, of course. They agitated for the passment and enforcement of laws against sex discrimination, for reproductive rights, for women's access to job training programs, many of which were set up in some sense as a response to the Moynihan Report, and to the inclusion of women in emerging affirmative action programs. African American feminists also engaged in a lesser-known but no less powerful campaign to advance an alternative vision of the family structure that government policy should promote. So Moynihan and his interpreters suggested that African American families should pattern themselves on the male breadwinner, female homemaker ideal that had animated public policy since before the New Deal. In sharp contrast, women such as Polly Murray, Eleanor Holmes Norton, Patricia Roberts Harris, and Eileen Hernandez positioned black women as role models for white women and egalitarian black marriages as worthy of white couples' emulation. This gender egalitarian vision of marriage, in which husbands and wives shared breadwinning and caregiving responsibilities, animated many of the constitutional sex equality cases that came before the Supreme Court in the 1970s. Ruth Bader Ginsburg litigation campaign attacked government preference for traditional gender divisions of family labor. Ginsburg and her allies insisted that the state could no longer assume that women were always economically dependent upon men, or that wives never provided for their husbands and children, or that a father's care was less important than a mother's. In a series of cases challenging sex-specific allocations of government benefits, this campaign largely succeeded in rendering marriage formally or legally gender neutral. In a way, then, the African American feminist vision of egalitarian marriage had come to fruition, at least as a matter of formal legal doctrine, though of course not yet of social reality on the ground. Now, to be sure, this vision and its implementation suffered from limitations. Neutralizing the benefits of marriage did little for the increasing numbers of women and men for whom marriage remained out of reach. But feminist advocates did succeed in challenging the assumption that had pervaded the debate over the Moynihan Report, that a male breadwinner, female homemaker model was the gold standard for family structure generally and for racial progress in particular. Feminists also sought to dispel the view that the rise of women necessarily implicated the end of men. They insisted that attacking economic disadvantage and inequality need not be a zero-sum game, pitting men against women or black against white. Ginsburg, for example, used male plaintiffs in part to underscore how sex discrimination hurt men and women and pushed them into traditional roles. The National Organization for Women self-consciously styled itself as pursuing equality in partnership with men. Civil rights and feminist organizations worked in a sometimes tenuous but crucial alliance to fight discrimination in employment. Fears about the end of men and the rise of women did not fade in the years after the Moynihan Report. As the historian Natasha Zaretsky described, as early as the early 1970s, quote, this anxiety that middle and upper class families were coming to resemble their poorer counterparts was accompanied by the related fear that the ostensibly stable divide between white and black families was breaking down. Perhaps then Polly Murray was the prescient one when she observed in 1966 that black men's gender anxieties were harbingers of a more general American adjustment to women's advancement. So African American family life, in both its gender egalitarian professional and struggling single-parent guises, proved a bellwether for American society more generally. At the same time, the gap between the affluent, educated, and married on the one hand, and the working class and poor, less educated, and increasingly unmarried, grew in a way that crossed racial lines, but also accentuated the gap between rich and poor, a gap that was, of course, is and was and is, strongly correlated, though not synonymous with race. By 1985, Eleanor Holmes Norton was writing candidly in the New York Times Magazine of the toll family breakdown had taken on black families and communities. Norton called for both government intervention and community initiatives. What she did not do was prescribe different remedies for black men and black women or call for a return to the male breadwinner, female homemaker model. Instead, she encouraged gainful employment for women and men, education and job training for boys and girls, moving mothers from welfare to work, and ideally moving fathers into jobs and back into homes and parental roles. To put it another way, she did not assume that the rise of women meant the end of men or vice versa, but rather that men and women would rise or fall together. So the most obvious takeaway from all this, and in talking about the Moynihan Report, I in no way mean to suggest that the Moynihan Report and the book The End of Men or these other End of Men claims are equivalent, but just to sort of use the comparison to think about past claims about the end of men. The most obvious takeaway from this is that claims about the end of men and its association with the rise of women are not new. These claims and interpretations thereof have had multivalent consequences. They've led to misconceptions about the relationship between male decline and female progress. They've sometimes inadvertently obscured economic and racial and other inequalities of status by calling attention to gender differences first and foremost. But I want to suggest that past claims about the end of men have also sparked productive reactions from feminists and others that help to galvanize progressive activism and provoke fruitful conversations like the one we're having today. Thank you.
Before I read the other panelists' papers, I was going to talk about these recurring anxieties and panics about the end of men, but I think they all have explained those well enough, and you can multiply examples. It seems to come about every about 20 years since the 1890s. History certainly confirms that something revolutionary has taken place in societal and personal relationships between men and women, but it also warns against assuming that the revolution is complete or will be completed in the near future, and especially against assuming that the rate of change in the wake of a powerful upheaval, such as the 1970s push of feminism, will continue at the same pace into the future. Women continue to be held back by accumulated historical inequities, cultural prejudices about female capacities, double standards about looks, sexuality, aging, even self-assertion, and discriminatory work practices, as well as by supposedly neutral laws and practices that fail to take those historical inequities into account, and also, finally, by our own internalized stereotypes and expectations. So at every age group and educational level, as Philip Cohen shows, the average woman earns less than her average male counterpart, despite the incredible increase, very impressive increase, in female representation among the high-earning segment of the population. Women remain overrepresented among the ranks of the poor and underrepresented at the very highest reaches. Even the educated professional women who have moved the furthest toward personal and occupational equality often need more education and achievements than their male age mates just to pull even. A 2010 AAUW study found that among postdoctoral candidates, a woman had to publish 3 more papers in the most prestigious journals or 20 more in the less prestigious ones to be considered as productive as a male applicant. Now, as someone whose last book was about the transformation of gender roles since the 1963 publication of The Feminine Mystique, I'd certainly be the last to deny the stunning gains that women have made in the past 50 years. But as a Council on Contemporary Families symposium on the gender revolution showed, that came out earlier this year showed, there's actually been a stall since the mid-90s in several measures of progress toward gender equity. And of course, there have been actual setbacks in others. The new attacks on reproductive rights, the disproportionate job losses for women as the he session has turned into the she shrinkage of the public sector. Supreme Court rulings making it more difficult to prove pay and job discrimination. I think it still makes sense to talk about a revolution in gender relations, one that, as Hannah suggests, has transformed intimate relationships in unprecedented ways. But I also think there's been a real revolution in race relations, and yet the fact that we have titles like The End of Men and Matriarchy lead to a situation where if you applied it to the revolution in race relations, you might say, well, because we have a black president and that blacks have actually made greater percentage inroads into the ranks of high earners than even women have, that doesn't outweigh the historical disadvantages and continuing prejudices that leave African Americans the poorest of the poor and have actually increased some forms of segregation in the country, and it certainly doesn't mean the end of whites. Now, I also believe that, that Hannah gives women too much credit and men too little for their adaptability in the past few decades. I mean, if you look at the occupations that have been expanding, you could certainly make a good case that it's just been luck that our gender inertia, which has channeled us historically into the liberal arts and the caring professions and hospital work and service work, happen to be the ones that were increasing. Now that technology since then has been increasing, you're finding that we're not as flexible. In fact, the proportion of women earning technology and information degrees is now back to its 1980 level, so that men have been stepping into that. So I think that both of us continue to be plagued by continuing gender stereotypes, and I'm not sure that I would say that women have been any more flexible than men in their response. But Hannah and I end up, and I think most of us in this room would end up, in the same optimistic place when we assess the prospects for further convergence of men and women's options, choices, and achievements, and the benefits for both individuals and society to the gradual blurring and potential ending of gender binaries. But ironically, that gender convergence may, in the context of growing socioeconomic inequality, actually require us to move away from overarching pronouncements about the general trends of men and the general trends of women, and to pay more attention to class divergence within each gender and also within each racial ethnic group. That's why I'm very dubious about the notion of a traveling sisterhood, where the ascent of educated and privileged women into the higher ranks pulls up their sisters lower in the class pyramid and the income pyramid. In fact, the only way that many middle and upper middle class women are able to make their way toward the top is because of the availability of other women's cheap labor to take over their traditional housework and childcare duties. And few working women can afford to pay their childcare workers, nannies, or house cleaners the generous salaries that are offered by a few women in the top 1%. So despite the gender habits and values that women share across class lines, and sometimes because of those things, our responsibility for the family, women have sharp class differences that lead to diverging assessments of how best to protect our shared reproductive, sexual, and family needs and interests. For example, although most Americans now believe in pay equality, women who have greater opportunities to compete successfully in the labor market are much more likely to oppose any policies and values that reward a traditional division of labor in the household. By contrast, women with fewer economic or personal resources or less autonomy are often drawn to a culture of family values that emphasizes men's responsibility to look after women and children, and women's special nurturing needs or reproductive capacities. Surely one factor in the debates, the harsh debates we've been having over sexuality, contraception, abortion, and publicly funded childcare versus tax breaks for individual families is the conflicting assessments women make about how to manage our shared gender experience of bearing and raising children in the context of our radically different socioeconomic and community settings. So I would say that precisely because we really have moved so far and had such a revolution in the overthrow that some people say is patriarchy. I'm not sure I would have even described it as late as 1960s as patriarchy, but certainly of male entitlement. I think that in a sense we picked the low-hanging fruit in terms of the struggle for equality, for gender equality. And we have to worry a little bit about how we can continue to combat gender inequality without giving in to socioeconomic inequality. You know, like, let's be 1/2 of the top 1% of the population. That's not what attracted me to the women's liberation movement back in the 1960s. So I think that is the big challenge that we face. And that said, I certainly am really happy that the organizers of the conference have provided a format in which, over the next rest of the day and tomorrow, despite whatever differences we may have, we can have a collegial discussion of our common concerns for both gender equity and socioeconomic justice.
I'll give the panelists a chance to respond to the questions that I just posed, which I gave them before I got up here. And then I will and they can respond if they like, just to start the Q&A going, and then I'll open up for question and answer from the audience.
Okay, I'll begin with just a short response. You know, I think one reason why the elite organizations in New York and Massachusetts didn't produce that kind of propaganda. They did actually fund a lot of the campaigns in the western states. They spent money on flyers and posters. But the reason I think they didn't include those is they just found that kind of visual rhetoric unseemly. And most of their journal articles and their rhetoric and the posters and flyers, they really wanted to make sure that women took pride in their traditional roles, and that was the focus of most of their rhetoric. You know, they did have sometimes statements to the effect that it would be unfair for men who have been out in the harsh world taking care of their families to not have the benefit of a beautiful home and wonderfully raised children, and that there was a bargain associated with the traditional gender division of labor. And these new claims were upsetting that. But I do think that, you know, as members of upper class society, they found that kind of rhetoric and even the possibility of gender inversion in that way just unseemly, and they didn't discuss it.
So yeah, this is a difficult question, and even with the time to think about it, I'm not quite sure I'll have a satisfactory answer, but I'll try. One of the things that struck me as I was reading Hannah Rosen's book was both the differences and the similarities between the end of men claims in the late 19th and the early 20th century. I mean, one obvious similarity is that they're coming in the wake of significant economic transformations, but I think also one difference is whereas in the late 19th century, or I should say whereas in the early 21st century, the concern is primarily about white working class men. In the late 19th century, it was primarily a concern articulated by middle class and elite white men, and it makes sense given the nature of the economic transformation that was going on. So whether or not today's end of men claims have a particular purchase, I would think that to the extent that they do have a political purchase, it would redound to the benefit of the GOP. And I'll defer to, I guess, people who were political scientists, perhaps. My sense is that to the extent that there clearly is a gender gap. And people have been talking about the Democratic Party doing much better among women, but the GOP doing much better among men, and particularly working class white men. But that gender gap certainly predates the Great Recession. NASCAR dads was that the 2004 election, and so. And then if you think about it in terms of regions, it certainly, in the South, it certainly goes back to the 60s and the 70s. So I guess I would also say that in what I was interested in my talk is looking at the response of African Americans, and I think that one huge difference here is that African Americans have a different relationship to the nation state at this particular moment, and the fact that we have a black president. So there's no linkage of this the end of men claims with this sense among African American men in particular that our citizenship is under assault in the same way that it was in the late 19th century. Now, whether or not, I mean, so again, I don't know that. I mean, we don't see that having the same kind of impact on gender dynamics within the African American community, but I guess I'm a little less sure about that claim that I just made, so we can talk about that later.
I just wanted to say thank you to Chris for really helpful comments and questions. I guess she asked about sort of the relative impact of progressive versus more reactionary responses to the Moynihan Report. And it really, I guess her question really made me realize that two things. One, that it's very difficult to assess, obviously, the impact of the Moynihan Report or of any particular event on what happened subsequently. And it strikes me that a full answer would have to contend with sort of a complicated chain of events and reactions that really kind of occurred over several decades. And my paper doesn't even begin to explore the complexity and the variety of the reactions, even just in the 1960s. So you had the liberal and civil rights establishment having a range of reactions to the report. You had a scholarly reaction. There was a liberal feminist reaction that I described a little bit in my presentation, but there were also much more radical feminist reactions that rejected marriage rather than promoting a vision of egalitarian marriage, rejected marriage altogether. There was a welfare rights movement reaction, which emphasized improving single mothers' status rather than trying to avoid single motherhood. And then, as James Patterson relates and emphasizes in his recent book on the history of the Moynihan Report and the controversy it provoked, conservatives, particularly in later decades, seized on Moynihan's emphasis on family structure and on individual and community initiative as to oppose government intervention such as welfare provision or affirmative action and so forth. The other thing I wanted to note is that I think these end-of-men claims, particularly discrete events such as the Moynihan Report, highlight the degree to which these were picking up on arguments that were already being made. This was not the Moynihan Report was not a new claim. It was something that had, as many historians have developed, had strands of it had been developed by sociologists, including African-American sociologists, quite prominently in the decades preceding the Moynihan Report, which I think makes it important to look at least the Moynihan Report and potentially present-day end-of-men claims more as tools that existing social movements and political movements and individuals can use to further agendas that they have already that are not actually prompted by these end-of-men claims, but they're using these end-of-men claims to instrumentally further particular agendas. And in that regard, Chris had also asked me earlier about whether conservative organizations had been using end-of-men claims in a way that Professor Summers just suggested they might. And it struck me that certainly there's plenty of opportunity to do that, but indeed conservative organizations have been making arguments about the end of men and the war on boys already, and so it's really a question of using the arguments as opposed to developing them.
I'd like to chime in if I may. Kristin didn't pose any questions to me because I hadn't decided what I was going to say. She didn't have any advance notice. But I would like to respond to that because it seems to me that although there are many people using these phrases in very different ways, that in this particular historical moment, concerns about the end of men speak to a legitimate populist concern that gets left out of many feminist discussions. Let me give you an example. Last year I received this breathless communique from NOW pointing out that there'd been this massive percentage increase in the number of women in poverty. And with no comment at all, that hidden at the bottom of it was the information that the year before there'd been this massive increase in the poverty rates of men that had gone up higher than those of women for temporarily. And so I think that when anybody raises this concern about the end of men, whatever their own motivations in raising it, they are speaking to some serious and legitimate concerns about what is happening to white male workers whose real wages, now, of course, women's wages, real wages, have been rising. They're still not as high as men. They've been rising from an artificially held down base. Nevertheless, many families and people who are supporters of women's equality are very concerned about the challenges posed to men by the decline of traditional male occupations. And although several of us have made the argument that this is partly a masculine mystique thing, it's also partly something that men are still held to by women, as was pointed out by Joan Williams in her question, that they are supposed to be responsible for supporting families, and women still often have a double standard about what kind of man they will marry. So I think that unless we can tap into that sympathy and understanding, instead of letting it being diverted into either the triumph of us wonderful women or into the attacks on men by us terrible feminists, it's very important that we relate to this as a serious, legitimate concern.
Okay, we have just time for a few questions. Sorry, we started late, so we're going late, but we can continue the conversation over lunch. Does anybody have a question? I know we have a roaming mic somewhere. Questions? Anyone? You're starving. Okay. I'd like to thank the panelists for their fabulous papers, and thank you.